Welcome to WTF Is Up. I'm Jeremy.
And I'm Omar.
Omar, why is it that the tech industry was the electromagnet that united our forces?
Well, we're both veterans of the tech industry. We worked in a variety of companies at different sizes, and it was like this big MBA aspiration for us. Let's go work in tech. That's the exciting sector that actually maybe values our degree. And it was kind of where we cut our professional teeth. So, Jeremy, you're out there in the heart of it in Silicon Valley. What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, so I think there are three big things that are really dominating the tech scene today. And I want to talk about them with you, Omar, because I think they're going to be really important for our listeners, whether you're a student, a job seeker, a career coach. And the reality is, number one is the gorilla in the room. What's going on with AI? Is AI a bubble? Is AI here to stay in its current crazy form, or is something else headed towards the tech industry? So that's number one. Number two is tech's influence on culture. I think when we first got to tech, we felt like outcasts, way out from the power centers of New York and Washington. Now tech has invaded all those areas for better or worse, and we'll discuss that. And then finally, what's going on with tech jobs? If you want to start a career or build a career in tech, is this a good time? And if so, how do you ultimately break in and become successful?
Yeah,
So with
yeah, I
that
love
said,
that.
yeah,
Is tech now the same thing as AI? Is AI eating tech? And then the power that these companies and the individual leaders have in our society and our culture, our politics, and then WTF people can actually do about it if they're working in tech, want to work in tech. What company is not a tech company these days? So in some ways, this is just about careers and give you some tips and tricks.
and as with all good WTF is Up episodes, Omar, will you please bless this episode with an amazing dad joke?
As with all of our episodes, it's not going to be amazing. Okay, Jeremy, when babies are born in Mountain View, California, what do they say?
Google?
Yeah, Google Gaga.
Ah, there we go. And for those who don't know, Mountain View is the hometown of Google, as well as LinkedIn, where Omar and I used to work together.
As well as Jeremy. So that's a good segue, Jeremy. Let's give our listeners a little bit of a sense of like, WTF did we actually do in tech? And then maybe what's one key thing that you learned in your time in tech that either was great and you think tech is continuing to do or should be doing and is no longer?
Yeah, so I'll be really honest, Omar. One of the things that brought me out to Silicon Valley in the first place, because like you, I started as an educator back on the East Coast, is that feeling almost like of the, ancient westward expansion days of, wow, if I go to Silicon Valley, anything is possible. You can invent new ideas, invent new companies, invent new technologies. Sort of the world is your oyster. And I think or at least I should say, I saw that inside a lot of the companies that we worked at. So the LinkedIn's and the Apples and the startups and all that good stuff. But then I also saw that, as Kara Swisher has commented recently, tech companies are just that, companies. And as much as we have this idealistic sort of sense of them, at the end of the day, they have their shareholders, they have their investors, and they're always going to please those audiences over the idealistic employees who work for them. So that's my big awakening. What did you experience, Omar? What are some of your big takeaways?
So did you feel that when you worked in tech, or you just feel that it's really gotten out of control now, or you see it now?
Well, here's the big moment. And I'll actually come back to something that you told me at the time, Omar. I remember that at some point after we had started working at LinkedIn, LinkedIn had been on this crazy stock market tear. Everything was up, up, and up. And at the same time, people were really happy at work. They were
Yeah, they had
energized,
just
they were
IPO'd.
engaged. Yeah, we just IPO'd, all that good stuff. And then the stock tanked at some point. And all of a sudden, people were depressed. People were leaving the company. I was like, Omar, what the heck is going on? It's like the sky's falling. And you were like, hey, don't follow the candy trail. It's not about how fancy the lunches are. If the stock isn't doing well, people are not going to be happy. I think that was the first moment that I realized, okay, there's more here than pure idealism.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I had worked at a couple of tech companies before we worked together at LinkedIn and had just seen that the way that culture was driven by stock price. I think for me, the thing that I feel like has changed in tech that was not the case when we were in it, and just for context, I worked for five big tech companies. So, change tech jobs just about as often as I change my shirts. And I think what's changed now is just the mobility, right? Like I was not even seeking these new roles in tech. I was found for them. And that I don't feel like, I could be wrong. I'm not in tech anymore. I'm not living out there. I'm not in the milieu, but it's still my network. It's still the majority of my experience. I don't get pinged anymore by recruiters. And I feel like actually, I don't just feel like this is borne out by the data that some people are calling it the great hesitation in tech. People are just not switching jobs like they used to. And it used to be, and there was a time not that long ago when the big tech companies actually agreed to stop poaching each other's engineering talent.
Yes.
You remember that?
Steve
And
Jobs and, I think it was Eric Schmidt over at Google at the time
and
had
maybe
this sort of
Adobe.
gentleman's handshake. Yeah.
Yeah, a couple other places, right? Because they were like, "We're in this war for talent. If we don't actually sort of, cooperate a little bit here, it's just gonna salary is gonna keep going up and up." And I remember an engineer telling me one time, is interviewing for a software development job, and if you just say the words, "I'm also interviewing with Google," you get a 50% raise and an immediate offer, right? So that was the environment we were in. It wasn't just engineering jobs, right? But neither of us were highly technical people, but even in product marketing type jobs, there was a lot of opportunity to move around. And I feel like now we know actually it's not the case. Big tech, of course, jobs are going away. But what that means is the people who are in those jobs are holding on to them. And the tech industry is just changing jobs way less now than they had been in recent years. There's a bunch of other factors related to that, but I think it's really interesting to think about that and the implications of that, right? Because it doesn't open up spots for other people. It doesn't open up spots for new grads. And so I just see the great hesitation. I see a lot of fear and panic in people, especially in big tech. All tech is not the same. Smaller tech companies, growing tech companies, even mid-size, vertical SaaS, there's still a lot of great roles and companies in tech that aren't necessarily the household names that you think of. My wife works for one of them and does not fear for her job security, knock on wood. But generally speaking, at least with respect to big tech, I think people are living in fear and they're holding on to the jobs once they get them.
Yeah, a lot of job hugging going on right now and not of the, lovable hugging kind, so
The one
absolutely.
company that is actually hiring and has made a commitment to hiring, I think, 20,000 people in the next few years, Apple, where we both worked,
Uh-huh.
And my theory on that is like they actually make shit. They're not a great software company, let's be honest, right? But they're making real physical things in the world that there's always going to be demand for because the design is so great, right? And the
So
brand.
true.
Okay. So having level set a little bit of our experience, let's talk a little bit more about WTF is actually going on with tech. And you mentioned AI at the top. So what's going on with tech and AI? This feels like it's eating the whole world. AI is eating tech. Tech and AI are eating the world and the economy. Is this a bubble?
Yeah. So here's the facts, and then we can get into the analysis. First of all, even though the American stock market is typically doing pretty well this year, so much of that is driven exclusively by AI. Get this, Omar. 80% of all US stock gains this year have come from AI driven companies. So a lot of the Mag 7s that we've always been talking about. 92% of all GDP growth was driven by those AI investments. Without it,
Wow.
GDP would actually be flat. And then finally, I think the biggest and most troubling sign recently is these huge 10-figure deals between all the AI companies. So OpenAI alone has done deals with Nvidia, AMD, and Broadcom in just the last 2 weeks alone, which is raising questions about the incestuous nature of this mix. So that's what's going on, Omar. As far
So
as
is it a bubble?
yeah. Is it a bubble? That's the question. And I think, we're not here as stock advisors or telling you how to invest your IRAs. So please don't listen to us on that basis. But I've got to say it is. And here's why. I think when you look at the underpinnings of when anything is really a bubble, is that there's not a payoff at the end. Whether you go back to Dutch tulips or late 90s, pets.com style stocks, the problem with all of those things is even though they were valuable at the time, the value was driven by the scarcity, this sort of gold rush mentality. And at the end of the day, all you had was pretty petals or a whole lot of empty boxes that no one actually wanted. However, when you got to, say, the 2000s era stock market, where you had the Googles and the Facebooks of the world that were IPOing, these were companies that were actually making money, actually producing return on investment, as we MBAs tend to obsess over. And so the thing that gives me the biggest concern about the sort of lack of results behind what's happening now, Omar, is that big MIT study that 95% of all AI pilot projects started by businesses across this country have produced exactly zero financial results, zero return on investment. And to me, that says the emperor has no clothes. But what's your take?
I don't think it says that. I think it says we're in the early days and enterprises are still trying to figure out what the heck to do with this technology. I also feel like tech companies, and again, what company is not a tech company now, has this pressure, maybe even like a compulsion to use tech, right? There's all these funny memes right now of like companies forcing their employees to use AI and how it's like they don't really know what to do with it and they're like drowning in the Kool-Aid. But it is possible that the emperor has no clothes ultimately, and there's the vague promise. But I think jury's out a little bit, and I think the pattern over the last couple of years is clear that we shouldn't bet against the rapid development of AI into fill in the blank area, right? Now, I could be wrong about that, but especially when you see that the vast majority of VC money is going into AI companies, you're going to have a lot of really great industry specific deep uses using these models where the models themselves are being trained for a mass audience. So I think that's coming. I think utility will just increase as that comes. But
And let me ask you about that, Omar, because this is really important. I think a lot of what the investors would tell you is we're investing in AI today, not for where AI currently stands, but because of where we think AI will end up. So this is
right.
that fabled AGI, where basically AI can do everything that a thinking human can do someday. Do you feel like your prognosis of early days rests on AI getting to that point? Or you're just saying, hey, we're not using it really well yet. Even the AI technology that exists right now could have better results if we have more time to play around with it.
I do think the latter is true, and that's most of what I'm saying. But I think people just have slightly outdated and not perfectly applicable models to the current day, right? So the reason that everybody's investing big in this and you see these deals happening and they're kind of incestuous is because the belief is there's going to be a winner, maybe two, right? The analogy would be Google, right? They won and are kind of the only player in the internet search business. Same thing happened in the 90s and early 2000s with Microsoft. And that's people, at least in the tech industry, that's their model, right?
Yeah. But let's talk about those models because I think this is a really interesting comparison.
It's winner
I
take
de-
all, right? Winner take
well,
all.
that's what I want to test though, because I was thinking, those are winner take all because of network effects. So, for example, like take Facebook. Facebook is still the preeminent, most valuable social media company in the world because it's a lot harder to join Facebook number two once all your friends are on Facebook number one. And yet I wonder, like, I spend probably 6 hours a day going back and forth between ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini and all these different tools. I have no loyalty to any one individual tool. To me, that feels more like the airline business. I fly Delta, I fly American. If I have to, I fly Spirit. Whatever is cheapest and most easily available, the proof is in the pudding. Like none of those companies are nearly as valuable as the big tech companies. So do you think that AI is more like Google and Facebook, or is it more like airlines?
It's a good question. I think the hope and the goal of the big AI companies, in particular OpenAI, is to be the Google, the Microsoft. In fact, they want to actually be the new Google, right? They want to be the front door to the entire internet and really to your life. I don't know if you saw the deals that they recently announced at their developer conference, but basically the appification of everything. You can get an OpenAI experience in all of your other apps, Spotify, etc. And to your point about the incestuous nature of all of this and how they're all partnering with each other, a lot of people are saying now, hey, OpenAI in particular is already too big to fail. And
Mm.
right, and you mentioned how it's driving the economy, actually, this industry unto itself. So I guess this is why I say it's an inapplicable. It's not a perfectly applicable. Maybe inapplicable is the wrong word. It's not a perfectly applicable model from earlier phases of tech. But I do think that even if there's not going to be a single winner, the important thing is that the leading companies in this space, OpenAI, Anthropic, Microsoft, Google, they are and Meta, they are playing the game as if that is going to be the case, and they are erecting as many barriers to entry to others and doing these deals that future proof their position as much as possible. I'm not saying it's going to be one per se, and I don't know how to opine as to whether like you reach AGI and you've now won and all the benefits will accrue to you. Like I don't know about that, but I certainly don't think it's going to be 5, 10. It's not going to be airline level choice, right? You
Mm.
you do develop some loyalty to certain tools over time. and you see more use cases with specific tools in certain industries. For example, Anthropic in tech and software development, right? So we'll see. But what I wanted to say was that I don't think of this as a bubble per se. And this is interesting for us to have this conversation because I'm out here on the East Coast in central Virginia. So I'm not where you are. But I see it a bit from the outside looking in as just an increasingly exclusive cabal. You mentioned that the circularity of all of this is almost becoming more important than singularity. And what you were
Oh,
talking about, the web of connections here, there's this great graphic that came out a week or two ago. Like they are all connected and they are trying to make sure that again, they're trying to buffer against any failure because if one piece of that fails, then they're going to bring others down with them. So the incentive, they're trying to align all these incentives. You have no government regulation really, right? So I think that it's a bubble in the sense that there's very real excitement. To your point, is there actually economic and pro- production value of attendant with that level of investment? And then are they just building an ecosystem that like can't fail, right? Are they just building an ecosystem that is propping themselves up separate from the actual value being provided? That's what I see happening. And the last thing I want to say is forget the economic returns. You and I wrote a book for job seekers. I always think about the employment market. And
mm,
to my original point at the top of this episode, the reason that I'm a little skeptical about tech right now is, especially big tech, especially AI, is that it's a dwindling employer, right? Jobs are decreasing. Overall tech employment is more or less flat year on year. That's when you look at the entire sector. If you take out AI companies, it's down, right? And this isn't just big tech. By the way, it only employs between 4 and maybe 7, maybe tops 9%, depending how you define tech, of American workers, right? So this is like
mm.
a sliver of the actual job market to begin with. And I think it's a shrinking sliver. So I view it as, yeah, maybe there's a lot of hype about it right now, but I don't see that they're there in terms of prioritizing hiring and keeping people. And we're going to give you some strategies at the end of this episode about that. But that's where my skeptical antenna goes up and says, hey, yeah, that meets some of the criteria for a bubble because you're deriving all this value, but you're not, but are you really putting it in? And are you putting your money where your mouth is and not just seeking those returns, but hiring people, building lasting organization?
We're going to have to stick a pin in this episode and revisit maybe in 6 months or 12, because I think that that bubble drumbeat will continue to sort of build on the headlines of financial publications, even in national news. And we'll find out whether this is all smoke and mirrors or something even bigger coming up really soon. But in the
Yeah,
meantime,
we'll
Omar,
we'll get back to you as to whether, indeed, once somebody in our next episode, by the time somebody's achieved AGI, the spoils have all gone to one
sorry,
company,
the next
and we're all
episode will be
screwed.
brought to you by Omar GPT and Jeremy GPT. That being said, what I think is even as fascinating as AI itself are all the cultural residuals of AI that are starting to seep into our society. And what I mean by that is, again, as I mentioned at the outset of this episode, tech used to be seen as outside of culture. It was off there on the West Coast doing its crazy thing. And now we're seeing tech start to influence culture through things like, the big Sora app that came out from OpenAI recently, all this AI generated slop that's showing up on TikTok and Instagram. And then at the same time, there are all these tech companies that are working more closely with government than ever, that are saying, hey, we'll settle our lawsuits with the Trump administration, that will just sort of say, hey, we want to make sure that we're on the right side of the Trump administration in terms of allowing or disallowing certain apps in our app store. And so it feels like more than ever, tech is not a sideshow, it is the main attraction in terms of American culture. And so I'm curious what you think, Omar, in terms of what's happening right now with tech and culture. Let's start, first of all, with some of this AI generated content out there. When you look at Sora videos, when you look at some of this AI slop, so to speak, what's your take? Is this genuine content, genuine creativity, or is it all just a bunch of button mashing teenagers?
It's interesting that most of the usage of Sora as the fastest growing social network in history and most popular app on the App Store right now is like teenage boys, right? They're just like making fun of each other, putting their faces on videos. Will that be a long term use case? I don't know. It is true that these tech companies, in particular social media companies, as well as AI, are have outsized influence on the culture and on how opinions are formed, on how communities are formed, probably how most people are getting their news, quote unquote, right? And of course, there's the worsening filter bubble where you teach your algorithm certain things and that's all you're going to get. So the radicalization element that can happen with that is a little bit scary. So, I don't know whether it is culture, the AI slop and the memification of everything. There's some AI musician or AI band that is like putting out like 3 albums a week and getting millions of millions of streams. Like people think it's pretty good, and that's because music has become so formulaic, and it turns out you can just like easily gamify that. Hollywood is
Let me
all up.
ask you about that, Omar. So there was this very viral post from this website, The Oatmeal, and The Oatmeal is produced by someone who has a strong sort of art background. And this artist was saying that when I look at AI generated art, whether it's pictures, videos, music, whatever, I feel moved by it emotionally the same way I do by human art. But then when I discover that it was actually created by I feel really empty or dirty or whatever the word is in terms of the strange feeling like, hey, this non organic being created this thing. Do you feel the same way? Like when you discover something is AI generated, does that ruin it for you in a way?
I do wonder if this is the long-term arc of AI, much like we're seeing now with cell phones, right? And even social media. Right? 10 years ago, it was like, oh my God, this is amazing. We all need it. Then it became toxic and way too ubiquitous. And now there's like a bit of a backlash, right? Phones are being banned in schools. Kids increasingly are not going to social media, which is great. We're setting our own limits on those kinds of things because we realize now we don't actually relate to that in the same way as real people or as V1 of the internet. So I do wonder if there's going to be that kind of backlash. Personally, I feel less satisfied when I use AI. I'm not really answering your question about being a consumer of AI products, but as a producer, like my dad joke at the beginning of this episode was terrible, but I thought of it, right? I had an even worse one that I thought of, but I don't want to ask the AI for that, right? I want to write
Yeah.
another book. I do not want
Yeah.
AI to write my next book or any piece I'm writing or anything, right? So as a consumer, though, I do think there's some generational differences too. And Hollywood is up in arms about this because you're
Yeah.
seeing, you can
AI
create.
generated actress out there, Tilly
Yeah,
Norwood.
and going back to the strike we had not that long ago, Sora starts to get into like, well, you can actually create compelling video stories and how much input or creative control do you really need to have over that? There's long been a debate about digital art and whether that's actually art. Now it's way easier to even create any of that. I guess I don't have that strong of a reaction to that. And it makes sense to me that artists would, but I don't know if that's the same as what broad culture, consumer culture feels. I think in the case of music or even like film and TV, if you like something, right? Like my daughter likes this AI slap music because guess what? It sounds a lot like Taylor Swift, which also sounds a lot like Dua Lipa and all the other artists. It's
Right.
like it's hard to differentiate, and those
Yeah.
lines are only going to get blurrier.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because I was going to say, I don't think, and I hope that I'm right about this, that I have seen a whole lot of stuff that was completely indistinguishable from human generated. Like when you see this stuff on Sora, yeah, it looks realistic, but it's also so outlandish and so ridiculous that there's not really that part of your brain that's like, wow, I'm looking at, a real video of MLK on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. That being said, I think to your point and to your daughter's point, if it does get to the point that you really blur those lines, we really can't tell, now you have a really weird moment because you start to wonder, like, what is our value in our own species, in our own society, if our AI devices can create better stories than we can? Because, like, in some ways, that's
Yeah.
our fundamental human distinction. We are the
Right, right.
storytelling species.
Right, totally. Yeah, I mean, like, this is getting really philosophical right now, but, I've long thought we need a watermark on, like, whether when things are AI generated, and I think a lot about education, right? Like, we need to know teachers would love to know whether students are generating things with AI, but maybe as consumers, we have a right to know that too, and then figure out how we feel about that, which, of course, is going to be shaped by how influencers online tell us about how to feel about it. My question for you, Jeremy, on this topic of the cultural power of tech and how that's increasing is like, Do you feel like you mentioned at the beginning of the episode, your big learning from working in tech and observing it now from the half outside being in Mountain View, California, like you mentioned that the tech industry is just industry, right? They're in some ways chasing returns. They are opportunists, and I think you could skeptically view a lot of the stuff happening with some of the tech leaders right now and the way they're working with the administration and presenting golden statues or whatever Tim Cook, right? As like proof of that. But do you think there's anything specific that tech is doing that other sectors are not in terms of trying to just play nice and get sweetheart deals? Do you feel like they should be using the platforms that they have, including the money that they have, right? We're talking about billionaires in our society
Yeah.
to lead on some things, or do you think it's just inevitable that they're going to follow and put profits first?
Yeah. So the way that I always think about this, because you're right, it's tough. It's very easy to condemn Sundar or Satya or whoever is bending a knee today because you're like, oh, what a sellout. But then if you were in their position and you had all these shareholders breathing down your neck, maybe you do the same thing.
Not to
The
mention
reality,
they're all
yeah,
doing it, right?
they're all doing
Very
it. So they
little,
have the
and
cover of, hey, my
talk
buddy
about
did it. Yeah.
collective action, also collective inaction.
Yeah. I think the way that I always try to think about this, and this is so Silicon Valley, is I have to say, what would Steve Jobs have done? Because I think if anyone embodied that sort of pirate ethos of Silicon Valley, like we're special, we're different. Steve Jobs had the original engineers of the Apple #1 or Apple II, like sign the motherboard because they were artists and artists signed their work. I kind of think that even though he wouldn't have been out there necessarily like leading the articles of impeachment, I think in his own way, he would have been trying to say, we stand alone. We are the ones who are creating value into society. So we have a special ability and responsibility to speak up for the powerless in our society. And again, I don't know exactly how that would have played out. Maybe that's just wishful thinking, but I do think that's the case. The one thing that gives me hope, and I'll say this, is that even though these giant corporations are corporations, and so they have the stupid, Milton Friedman like idea of like they can only serve their shareholders, they can't focus on society. The reality is there is this new pirate ethos brewing in Silicon Valley of all these young 20 somethings coming out to San Francisco, driving up rents, working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, kind of China style, to build these crazy AI startups. And you could say maybe they have more in common with gold rushers just trying to get rich personally than people trying to make the world a better place. But at least there is this sense, I think, again, of energy and hubris and whatever kind of heady mix of Silicon Valley alchemy that's coming back here. And we'll see what that leads to. Maybe there'll be a new generation of leaders who actually have the guts to speak up for their values.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about what you can actually do in the face of all this, and starting your own thing in this space is definitely one of those things you can do. But real quick on that, I'm curious, how do you evaluate? Because I work with entrepreneurs all the time who are really excited about this technology and the barriers that it's lowering now to entrepreneurship, right? And, whereas it would usually take months or even years of customer validation, product development, et cetera, you can get really far in a vibe coding session for I was sitting with a startup last week, a student startup. In 2 hours, they had a product, a business plan, a target market, and we're starting to could go get customer sentiment, right? That was 2 hours of work. Are
Wow.
those real companies? How do you even evaluate that?
Yeah, well, my take is it's actually less about the vibe coding and more about the AI application. And it
Right.
could be vibe coded, it could be hand coded, whatever. I think we'll have a new term like artisanal hand coded by humans. This is actual human code, where I think some of the most exciting AI startups are not just doing this, hey, let's take ChatGPT or Claude's API, stick it into Salesforce and call it our new like AI model. Instead, they are basically trying to say, hey, how can we use AI to solve problems that were unsolvable before? And I'll give you a good example. There is a startup that I'm a really big fan of called Udly. I don't know if you've heard of it, Omar.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, yeah, basically AI for interview prep. And this is the kind of thing you never could have done before the advent of AI. So it's not just like AI accounting or AI, you know, for HR, just doing the same kind of usual things. It is literally helping people who can't afford a career coach get human level awesome feedback on those human level skills. Communication, warmth, engagement, all those things that can make or break your career that were only the province of MBAs who had really fancy career coaching teams. Now anyone can get access. And that's what gets me excited is the idea that like, what can we do today with AI that would never have been possible 3 years ago. That's what I'm most excited about.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree with that. And go back and listen to our episodes on entrepreneurship because the key thing Jeremy's saying is that there is value creation if you can razor focus on an intensely felt customer problem. And that is not going away because of AI. In fact, it opens up a whole bunch of new possibilities. But you got to make sure that you're solving a real problem that exists in the world that current tools are not adequately solving, that you can execute better, of course, right? But if you don't have a real pain point that somebody feels and can eventually somehow pay for, somebody in the ecosystem will pay for, then you're dead in the water before you even get started. So that's the key thing. It's not about the technology or not the technology. So Jeremy, let's keep talking about and just close our episode with a little chapter here on what people can do about it. So we've talked a little bit about entrepreneurship, but let's talk a little bit more about what's going on with tech and careers. I think if we want to talk about both your expertise in the company you started, which is if you're interested in tech, maybe big tech is not hiring the way they used to, but there's still plenty of jobs in tech. How do you break in? And then we also want to talk about how you stay in if you've broken in, given that great hesitation, right? How do you not lose your job? So what WTF do you think people can do about all of this, whether you're working in tech or want to?
Yeah. So I'm going to give some very kind of paradoxical advice, which is if you want to work in tech in 2025, don't get more technical. Don't go out and learn to code, get more human. The reason I say that is I feel like the tea leaves that we're starting to be able to read are pointing out that the people who are most successful in the tech industry today are not the coders, not the data scientists. Everyone has been successful for the last 20 years, but the people who have the human skills, either in addition to or instead of some of those technical skills. Let me give you two examples. Mark Benioff at Salesforce has basically said for the last year, we're not hiring any more engineers. And this is despite the fact that they're going way big into AI, doing way more stuff. At the same time, they said we're not hiring any more engineers. He said we're hiring 5,000 new salespeople. And what he said is specifically was we are hiring those salespeople because someone needs to explain how this AI is useful to our customers. That is a human task. AI cannot explain itself. Code cannot explain itself. That's what the salesperson does. An interesting example. Example two. Stanford researchers just did this monumental study where they looked at payroll data for the last 5 years in Silicon Valley, specifically at software developers. For the longest time, whether you were a junior developer or a senior developer, everything was up and to the right. Along comes fall 2022. What comes out in fall 2022, Omar?
ChatGPT.
ChatGPT. All of a sudden, those two paths are completely divided. If you are a senior developer, everything is even better. There are more opportunities than ever to grow your career. But if you're a junior developer, the floor falls out from underneath you. And all of a sudden, there are no jobs, and you're applying for jobs at Chipotle just to have some income. What explains that? Well, you could say, oh, the senior developers are better at coding, all this stuff. But honestly, they learned coding back in the ancient days. Probably the junior developers have more advanced techniques. The reality is the senior developers are good at the human stuff. They're leading teams, they're managing projects, they're setting a vision, they're sort of managing up to the CTO and the CEO. That's what makes them valuable. And so my number one piece of advice for anyone who wants to be in tech is don't just focus on the technical, focus on the human. What's your take, Omar?
Well, and if you're focused on the technical, you might want to pivot that to AI research specifically, right? Where there's these data
Yes.
packages, et cetera. But just, on the human, I agree with that. My question to you, Jeremy, is how do you develop those skills? And probably more importantly, how do you show them? I would argue that businesses, any employer do not have great ways right now of vetting for that outside of, some vibes they get during an interview, which increasingly people are doing with AI telling them what to say in the interview, right? So, how do you showcase your people skills and also how do you develop them?
Yeah, so this is going to be very self-serving for you, not for me. So it's okay for me to say people should be doing entrepreneurship. If you're a student or if you're currently going through a period of unemployment, it's crazy to me that you're not out there trying to build something because what's going to force you to build those human skills? Getting out there and doing it, not sitting at home, not reading a book, not reading a website and having FOMO, like going out there and trying to get a customer, going out there and trying to convince someone to come along with you on this journey. And to me, the single best way that you can prove the skills that you just built is to walk the talk. All these resumes say, I'm a great people person. I work really well with teams. I'm like, oh yeah, prove it to me. How come you didn't email me directly as the hiring manager to tell me how excited you were about my job? Why did you just get in line like a sheep and apply the same as everyone else out there? If you've got those skills around drive, ambition, outreach, show them off by finding your future boss, letting them know that you're in the game. Chances are, just by doing that, you've put yourself in the upper echelon. What's your recommendation, Omar?
Yeah, I love the learn by doing there, and entrepreneurship is the best way because you're just doing it. But that, whereas like the real skill set there is the entrepreneurial scrap, but apply that scrap to building human interaction ability, leadership ability, actually, even just the ability to relate to humans, right? How do you get scrappy about relating to humans? And that is in the job search process itself. That's in making sure you network, that the networking is not transactional, but relational, and you're actually exchanging value. You're have an orientation of curiosity. What are people actually doing? What is this job? How do they do it? How do they make themselves successful? You're networking once you get in because you're looking for mentors. You're trying to learn by observing, but also direct interaction and mentorship. You got to stay hungry and curious about the people side of things. And it is inevitable if you do that, that you are going to develop human skills, right? But what you can't do is say that's just a part of it, but it's not the biggest part. It's not the part that I'm concerned about. I got to prove my value. I got to take the advice Omar and Jeremy were giving in previous episodes about building job specific AI fluency. All that is really important. But what you're saying, Jeremy, is the enduring skill set, the thing that is not going to be replaced ever, is the ability for humans to talk to humans. And I do worry about that for people who have grown up in a digital age and increasingly an AI age where we know that conversation, that getting out of the digital world is just, it's so important. It's more important now than ever. And you haven't come up in it necessarily. When you're starting remote work, if you can even get a job, when you're starting jobs remotely, you're not learning in meetings by observing the ways people interact. You're not seeing the meeting after the meeting. You're not able to get that direct mentorship in the same way. I mean, I just feel like I learned so much being in actual workplaces in the first 5 to 10 years of my career, not by trying to, honestly, of course I wanted to add value, but it was more what I was noticing and what I want, the little bits and pieces I wanted to pick up of how different people not just interact, but lead. And that's the key thing, right? And how do you do that above and beyond that next person for sure? How do you do that above and beyond technology has got to be clear. So Jeremy, are there any other like concrete skills you can identify here that people should be thinking about developing and showcasing? I think you've also pointed to, hey, maybe software jobs are going to get eaten by sales jobs. That seems true. But, anything else people can be thinking about as they build the soft skills?
Yeah, I think, one of the biggest hacks, and we talk about this all the time in our book Linked, is that especially in a world where we can no longer trust what we see on our screens, whether it's a video or a resume, the power of relationships will become more important than ever. And so, what I'm not talking about here is not just general relational skills, but actually building up the network before you need it. Because at the end of the day, if I am hiring in 2027 and there's all this AI generated stuff that looks so good, but I know I can't trust it because I don't know how strong the person's going to be behind it. And then there's someone who a friend or colleague is telling me is awesome. This guy, Omar, is an absolute rock star. I'm going to choose that person every single time because I just can't risk it by falling into that AI black hole of are they good or not. And so I think if we can start to cultivate our networks, get to meet new people, strengthen the relationships that we already have, even if you're not looking for a job today, having those solid relationships in place will help you so much more even down the road than they will today.
Yeah. And to that point, that is also really important if you're already working in this sector and you want to future proof yourself. You want to make sure you're not laid off. And because I think the reality is when companies decide that they need to let go of workers, and we know that that's increasingly happening, especially in big tech, as we said, they don't ask like who's doing great code, right? When budgets tighten, they ask, who do I like, right? Who do I like working with? It's really hard to bring the axe down on somebody who you just enjoy working with, right? And it isn't just about being likable. It's also about like adding that relational value we're talking about, being able to think cross functionally, having a deep bench of relationships that can go to bat for you if you're on the chopping block. Like I've been in these rooms. The way these things happen is There's calibrations at the management level, and each manager has to bring a few names. They have to look at their own team. And when you have people who feel like they're glue, or they're linchpins, cultural linchpins of the team, it's really hard to bring the axe down on those. So they ask first that question. Then they ask, again, not who's writing code, who's necessarily driving even the best results, but who is culturally adding value, who keeps our customers happy, who keeps ourselves happy, who actually figures out a way to create positive ROI within their own role. Now, maybe this goes to like every job, every remaining job is just going to be sales. But I would argue sales is that skill of internal communication, even external developing relationships, right? Looking in the box of your own role, are you producing more value than you are costing the company, right? So you want to become a part of that core that can't be replaced, not the cost center. One other part of that is that you've got to really be your own chief marketing officer within your employer. And this always felt weird to me, even as a marketer. But, it used to be the case you would see people kind of often rise up or get more responsibility or get, lionized as great employees who are great at marketing themselves, who are great at managing up, who are great at sort of building that web of people who think they're doing great work, even if they're not. And it's just really important that you promote yourself as much as possible, not in a gross or yucky way, but it's not a great strategy right now to be doing a bunch of amazing work in the dark, shadowy corners, right? You got to find ways of not just being a top performer, but communicating that you are a known top performer, right?
You know what I just realized, Omar? Maybe this is actually the exact place where AI can help. Because I think we have this human stigma against self promotion, probably rightfully so. No one wants to hang out with a braggart. But if we can turn ChatGPT into our agent, our own Jerry Maguire, and say, hey, like, take my performance review, pull out the things that are most relevant, maybe even figure out some creative ways to share it with colleagues or share it with the organization. Maybe that's the way to overcome that stigma and ultimately future proof our own careers.
Yeah, and it isn't just like bragging on LinkedIn or, I'd be curious what AI came up with about creative ways to do that. But the specific advice I was going to give is thinking a little bit more beyond your own specific role. So, of
Yes.
course, adding value there, making sure people see that value in your team and the people who are like closely tied to the same exact work that you're doing. But how can you help other teams? How can you do a 15 to 20% project that's outside of your core role that adds value to somebody else, leading a project maybe even outside your specific lane? Just thinking about that visibility, the depth piece is within your own team and your own role, and making sure that that value is there and people know that value, right? It's okay to toot your own horn sometimes, but also the breadth. How do you make sure that you have lots of people who know your work? And the only way to really do that is to help them, is to help a lot of different people.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about non-outsourceable skills, it's those kinds of things of, going above and beyond to help for humans, going above and beyond to help other humans, even if it's not your core narrow job.
Maybe that's actually the perfect note to end on, which is even though we've gone really deep into the tech industry today, perhaps the most important algorithm of all, more than AI or ChatGPT, is the human algorithm that's running between our ears, which still says we value those who help other humans. So I love that note, Omar.
Are we just saying all this to make ourselves feel better that humans are
That's
still going to
right.
have value?
We're just sort of whistling into the wind as AI starts to take over. But that being said, we will continue to cover WTF is up with both tech and AI in the weeks to come. So stay tuned there. In the meantime, for Omar, this is Jeremy, and we hope you enjoyed this week's episode of WTF is up. Please be sure to like and subscribe online. Cheers, everyone.
Bye.